most folks see the firewall as a place between the internet and the internal local area network within the enterprise. So we have this concept of a trusted network and an untrusted network. Now, one version of SIP trunks is to bring the SIP trunk in on the same internet connection that you bring your HTTP, email, streaming music, Netflix. Bring it all in on the same connection. That's one school of thought. Another school of thought says let's bring the SIP traffic, let's bring our voice traffic in on a separate connection completely. However you do it, if you bring the SIP traffic in over the internet connection, or you bring it in on a separate connection, do you really want to use the firewall as the SIP border controller? A more intelligent design, in our opinion, is to you might bring the traffic in over the same connection, but split it up. Let your firewall handle the data inspection and let your session border controller handle the monitoring of the SIP connection. So there's two ways to look at it. My preferred strategy is to bring the data to the voice VLAN through a separate connection. However, we're going to focus on this implementation here in which we bring SIP traffic in through the same connection that we bring our internet traffic in. Let's take a quick review of some of the aspects of SIP signaling that we need to be conscious of when we're configuring the SonicWall to be a session border controller. You understand that when Bob calls Alice, there is SIP call setup messages taking place largely in a clear text format, not unlike HTTP or web traffic, and it takes place over port 5060. UDP usually, or TCP, but it's separate from the actual voice traffic. Once the call is set up, the traffic flows from Bob's handset to Alice's handset through a protocol called RTP, real-time protocol, and some RTCP protocol, which helps control the sequence of those UDP messages. What I want you to be aware of is that in the SIP call control, the messages that set up the phone call, there usually is a little guy here called the session description protocol. And in this packet of information that flows along with the SIP setup, the invite message, is some information about what kind of a call we're setting up. So for example, the session description protocol might say, hey, I'm a telephone, meaning I'm not a video device, and here is the ports that I'm going to use when we set up our RDP stream. Now these port numbers are negotiated, and then if we're going to put a firewall in this mix here, or a session border controller for that fact, that device has to mediate these port numbers in such a way that we can keep track of them and know what to open and close and when to open and close them. So, what does the session border controller do anyway? I like to think of the session border controller as a kind of the 66 block of the internet age. Remember, if you're an old telephone guy, you'd punch down your equipment on one side of the block, and the phone company would punch their stuff down on the other side of the block. And then you'd put these bridging clips in, and in the bridging clip, if there was a problem, you'd pull the bridging clip out, and that would separate yours to internal phone network from the phone company. Well, a session border controller does pretty much the same thing. It provides network separation. It acts as a point of demarcation. It acts as a router, mediating the call setup between your internal phone system and the carrier's soft switch. It acts as a firewall, it monitors QoS, and it provides something called normalization. Normalization, think of it this way, think of it as a dialect. I think the folks in Texas speak a different flavor of English than the folks in Boston, and maybe the folks in Tennessee. We all speak English, but maybe we have a slightly different grammatical flair, not just an accent, but the choice of words. And sometimes in a SIP dialogue, we have to convert from the phone company's flavor of SIP to our internal flavor of SIP, and that's done through this process of normalization. This is a screen that shows some kind of voice normalization. Actually, this is built right into a 3CX PBX, but I like it because it demonstrates that you can go into the actual SIP headers, pick a SIP field like the contact field or the to field or the from field and switch it and actually change it to be something else. So I might want my display name to be my line number. And this is a form of normalization. It's done in different ways by different devices. In a Cisco Cube device, this would be done through the application of scripts to the SIP session. Here in the 3CX, it's done, with this type of an interface. Every session border controller does it a little differently. Understand, you will not be able to do this if you're using your SonicWall to manage your SIP session. So let's talk about setting up the SIP trunk. Setting up the SIP trunk in ShoreTel is pretty straightforward. Configuring it is not a big deal. It doesn't configure any more difficulty-wise than your normal PRI, for example. You've got to pay attention to details, but it's pretty simple. You first of all allocate some resources. You're going to go on the shore gear switch. You're going to select some resources, a particular switch to be your trunk ports, typically 5 per port. Select however many you are trying to set up. If you were going to replace a PRI, for example, that might be 23 channels, so 25 SIP trunk ports. You're going to go into sites. You're going to configure virtual IP address for your SIP proxies if you're setting up extensions. You need to get into call controls and set up some of the timing parameters. You're going to configure your trunk group. Now, in the configuration of the trunk group, aside from the normal digit manipulation and access code and home area code and things like that, there's a place where you're going to pick a profile, a SIP profile, and that SIP profile is going to contain certain specifics about your SIP trunk. I'm not going to get into that in this slide, but I want to point out one very key area. If you go back to our discussion about the SIP flowing between the two handsets, you'll probably think about it and realize that there is no switching equipment here to listen in on that conversation. Why do I want to listen in on the conversation? Well, I might have supplementary services. I might want to do a transfer. I may want to invite a recording device into the mix. I may want to set up a conference. If you've just got a media stream between two handsets, you're not going to be able to do that. What you're going to need is, I'll give you another example. If you have a pure SIP trunk and you call into the SIP trunk, and the trunk group defines you will be answered by the auto attendant, what's going to happen is the call will be set up Alice at this point is an auto attendant. If you dial some digits to select the extension or navigate the menu, chances are you're going to get disconnected. That's because there's nothing here to anchor that media stream while we go dial up a resource. So supplementary services play a role here, and the only way you're going to do that is to have a SIP profile that has hairpinning turned on. And in ShoreTel world, only the half-wide switches are able to do this hairpinning. So you can set these up on some of the older ShoreGear switches, or you can ignore hairpinning altogether. And you will be able to make trunk calls from a handset out to a SIP trunk and have a SIP call come in. Typically, you won't send it to an auto attendant, you send it directly to a handset. But if you want to take advantage of supplementary services, you're going to need some media termination points. In the ShoreTel language, they call it a SIP trunk media. It's actually a port that in the drop-down message menus under ports inside certain switches, if there are half switches, you'll see that you can select and make that port available as a trunk media. The good news is if you're replacing a complete PRI, you can just hit the checkbox that declares the entire switch to be made available for media resources. So keep this in mind. You're going to then configure your individual trunks, which will point at the IP address of your internet telephony service provider, and you probably want to make sure that you give privileges to access that trunk group to your various user group folks. In the SonicWall is an object-oriented firewall. Most late generation firewalls are reflexive in nature, and they enable you to create objects. So you're going to create some objects. You're going to create service objects and take those service objects and put them in service groups. And you're going to create network objects and put them into groups if necessary. In the SonicWall for ShoreTel, you want to go to the VoIP setting, and you'll find a checkbox there for enabling consistent NAT and another one for enabling SIP transformations. Uncheck those guys to start with. I have found generally they cause more problems. This has to do with application gateway layer, packet inspection. Okay, we've logged into the ShoreTel portal. We're on version 14.2, by the way. You can do this on previous versions, but in our world, version 14 is probably the best implementation of SIP on ShoreTel at this point. So if you can, make sure you get your system upgraded to 14.2. And then we'll also take a look at the SonicWall implementation. This happens to be a TZ250, but the interface is pretty similar to all the late model interfaces to the current line of SonicWalls. So here, again, we're going to go to trunk groups. We're going to set up a new trunk group. When you set up a trunk group, just go ahead and add a new trunk group at the site of type. You want to select SIP, and you're going to go ahead and fill that in. Give it a name. Here's the profile discussion that we had in the slides. And ShoreTel has some predefined profiles that you can select from. But what they have to do with is over here in the SIP profiles, you'll find SIP profiles for extensions as well as SIP profiles for trunks. So this is for the trunks, and if you click on that, you'll see the individual. So here's one profile for CenturyLink. And what I want you to notice here is that hairpinning is turned on here. See it? These different characteristics, if you want to change them, retype them down here in the custom parameters. So if we want to turn hairpinning off, this would be hairpin equals 0. But hairpinning is what's going to enable you to set up your SIP media proxies for your hairpinning and supplementary services. So back to the trunk groups here. I've already set up my SIP group here. I happen to be using less.net just as a good site. I like less.net for these type of tests because I can log into the less.net portal and see that side of the connection, so I can look at both sides of the connection if I'm troubleshooting. But at any rate, the concept of digest authentication, perhaps your service provider wants you to provide a username and password when you make an outbound call to them. So you'll select outbound, and or perhaps they want it for both. So you put your username and password in here. It's my recommendation that if you can have them establish authorization based on the peer relationship, in other words, they know your public IP, you know theirs, set that up as a static map, and that will limit the amount of potential bottlenecks. But digest authentication is just that. It's like logging into a website and you providing your username and password. How many digits are they going to provide us? Typically, SIP providers, it's 1 or 11. Seldom is it smaller, like on a PRI, you might have 4 digits the phone company passes to you. Your SIP guys are going to give you 10 or 11 digits. And go ahead and pick an access code. I would recommend that you put your SIP trunks on a separate access code if you have both PRIs, for example, and SIP trunks. Put them on a separate access code. The pecking order for trunk selection in ShoreTel is SIP trunks first, so keep that in mind. But for purposes of bringing up a new trunk group, put it on a separate level access so that you can dial select it at your election, and this way make certain that you're grabbing a SIP trunk. Also create a user group and make the trunk available. You'll go ahead and do that, and then go ahead and save this guy. Once he's been saved, you're going to go to individual trunks, and at this point you're going to say, at this particular site, add a new trunk in the trunk group that you previously named, in my case, SIP-less, and then go ahead and select it, give it a name, and then here you're going to provide the IP address that your service provider gave you for this purpose. You're basically pointing your SIP proxy at their SIP proxy. And then how many circuits do I want to create? At that point, you don't want to create 5 circuits. Go ahead, hit save, and it will in fact generate 5 circuits. I've already created them. You'll see here in the trunk list here my PRI circuits as well as my SIP circuits. And it doesn't get any more complex than that, guys. That's what it takes to create a SIP trunk in a SIP trunk group on a ShoreGear switch. Now let's go take a look at the SonicWall. So here's our typical SonicWall, and here are the components you're going to need to set that guy up. First, you're going to go to your firewall settings, and you're going to create some objects, and you will need to create address objects, and you will need to create service objects, and you'll put your service objects into your service groups. And then later on, after we do that, we'll probably go to networking, and we will create our NAT policies. If you're a big sissy, you can use the wizard here to help you along. Probably select the public server wizard and just walk through that. It'll rob you of understanding what's going on, but it'll get the job done. Let's take a look at the way I've done it here. First thing I did was to create some service objects. So I created a service object that I'm calling ShoreTel services, ShoreTel SIP services. And if I edit that guy, what you'll do is you'll go here and select the various objects that you want to call. Think of objects in this case as ports, right? So if you're going to use the SIP port, which is port 5060, you're going to want to go ahead and select it and move it over here. Now keep in mind, you can't create the services until you've created your objects. So individually, I've created a bunch of individual objects. I created them for ShoreTel RDP. That's port. Now, I want to point out in the SonicWall, when you get it, you will find that there is an object there called ShoreTel already. SonicWall has for some time created some objects for ShoreTel, but it was for the older MGCP phones, and all of the references in there, like port 5004, that was before SIP on ShoreTel. All of the media stream flowed uniquely through port 5004. And in SonicWall, they took advantage of that, and they created some ShoreTel service objects here, the ShoreTel IP phone control to port 2427 and so forth. These are not going to be useful for your SIP, so you're going to have to create one called SIP. It's UDP port 5060. Creating these is very simple. It's basically a fill in the form, give it a name, select the protocol, give it a port or port range. I happen to use port 5060 and 5061. TLS tends to be 5061, and I do it for both UDP and TCP. So go ahead and set that up. I also create one for RDP media because I want to be able to set up a range of ports. Now, this is the biggest bone of contention you're going to find in a firewall, is that UDP ports can be all over the map. They can be, 16,000 ports that could possibly be opened, and maybe sometimes it's just 10,000 through 20,000. It's going to vary depending on your provider, and so we'll want to discover that. The benefit of having it as a named service object is that you can go in here and change this. Same thing, for example, I created network objects, a network object or a address object. So if you go to address objects now, you'll find that I've created one called ShoreTel SIP proxy. These are groups at the top. You put your objects in groups, but the actual address objects are below here. So you'll create a new address object. I created one here called ShoreTel SIP proxy, and this is just the IP address of the Shore Gear switch that is providing the resources for my SIP trunk. So I just give a name, something that we can pick out on the firewall, and I give it a name. It's of a type host, and I gave it the IP address. And I actually do that. I created one here for the ShoreTel headquarters server, though this plays no role in the SIP trunk. I do have other occasions that I want to point to that object. So in SonicWall, you just go ahead and create it as an object. So once you have your your service objects, which you should think of as ports, these are the ports we're going to forward, and then you put them into a service group, right? So I took all of the individual service objects associated with my ShoreTel services needed for my SIP trunk, and now I drop them into something called the ShoreTel SIP services. So up here you'll find an address group, and in that group you'll see a ShoreTel service containing those objects. So once that's done, excuse me, we're going to go to network, and we're going to create some NAT policies. These are basically access permissions, right? So if you go here, actually I think I take that back. Access rules are configured onto the firewall, and they materialize as NAT statements in the network. So here you can go ahead and look at all the rules, or you're going to create a new rule, and you would say add, and it pop up this window, and you'll go ahead and fill out these forms. I have a separate document that shows how I filled this out, and it's available through membership on the portal. But let's take a look at how these rules were set up. So I don't want to look at all of them. They're too overwhelming. Let's just look at the ones I created. So if you go to the matrix button, it's going to show you LAN to LAN connections, LAN to WAN connections, LAN to VPN connections, and so forth. Let's take a look at the LAN to WAN connections. And you'll see here that the source address, ShoreTel SIP proxy, remember that that was an address object I created. It contains the IP address of my ShoreTel proxy, in this case 192.168.1.60, and it says it's free to go to any destination if it's using any of the services that are in the group called ShoreTel SIP services. We'll go ahead and allow that. Also switched on packet monitoring and enabled this rule. If we go back to the matrix now and look at WAN to LAN, right, we can see that I have created a rule that says if you see something from my network object, LessNet, which is my ITSP, I just gave it a name, LessNet, and defined its IP address. If it hits the outside primary IP interface and it is pointing at any of the services that I defined for my service group called ShoreTel SIP services, then allow it. There's a tendency to want to do something like if it's from anywhere, but you don't want to do that. You really want to limit it to your service provider. You don't want the high school kids with their script kiddies and their SIP fishes trying to scan for your open port 5060 and spending as much time as they can hacking your SIP proxy. Limit it to the source of your service provider. And at that point, it will go ahead and create the network ports. It'll go ahead and create the NAT policies. and you can find them. Here's search for custom policies. This will be the ones that are created, and once again you'll see here there's a ShoreTel SIP proxy hitting the main interface. If it has a port request for anything I've defined here, let it go. And likewise, there'll be the reflexive of this, which is just the opposite, which will be the opposite of that. So at that point, you've got your SonicWall configured. And if we go here to the ShoreGear on the headquarters server and bring up the trunk test tool, you'll see my trunks defined here. I've got 5 SIP trunks set up from my LessNet connection, and if I were to place a phone call to the DID number associated with my SIP trunk service provider, you will see that call actually ring in. I think I have it pointing at the auto attendant, so you'll probably hear it too. So let's go ahead. There's the call ringing in.
Calling. If you know the extension of the person you want to reach, you may dial it now.
And there's just a perfect example of setting up a SIP trunk on ShoreTel using a SonicWall in place of a session border controller. Again, can it be done? Yes. I really recommend that you not do it, or at least do not bring the SIP trunk through the same firewall that you're going to use for your internet traffic. When we get into troubleshooting, there are some things that we can do here to packet capture, a packet monitor. You can go ahead and configure the SonicWall. When you do so, when you're setting up your settings for packet monitoring, go ahead and exclude GMS, which is the it's a server application for managing multiple SonicWalls. Turn all this crap off. You don't want to look at that. Set up a interface. In this case, this is the ShoreGear switch that I'm monitoring. By checking this box here, it will automatically map it to the other address, so you don't have to fill in the whole box, just the guy that we're interested in. And if you want, you can go further to say that we're looking on that interface, we're looking for IP traffic. You can even drill down and say that I'm looking for a particular type of traffic or a particular port. But once you've got that set up, if you are troubleshooting, turn on the packet capture. Let's go ahead and clear this packet capture here, and let's go ahead and turn it on. Let's go ahead and fire that phone call in here yet again. So I have an incoming call. You can probably see it on the ShoreTel test tool.
Thank you for calling.
There it is.
The extension of the person you want to reach, you may dial it now.
And take up on that and stop capture, and there you can see traffic successfully. It initiated originally from the ShoreTel switch, went to my ISP, and so forth. So I hope you have found this informative, and I thank you for viewing.